let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining us again at the Salem Center for another event on energy. We have now a tradition of doing one or two of those every semester. And today we're happy to have with us Mark Mills, senior fellow of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, recently joined the Texas Public Policy Foundation, also a faculty fellow at Northwestern University in the School of Engineering. Mark has been involved in science and energy policy for a long time. Sorry to date you, but all dating back all the way to the Reagan administration, so good old days. And also as a scientist in Bell's lab for a long time, responsible for a lot of patents. So somebody has been in the practice of the field, but also now in policy of the field for a long time. So talking to us today about energy transition. So Mark, thanks for joining us, and take it away.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah, it's not good to date people, but that's okay. I was a child in diapers in the Reagan White House science office. So because everybody's sophisticated, what I'm going to do is sort of a fairly rapid fusillade of facts for you all to think about with respect to the phrase energy transition. And you can see that I'm putting in the context of politics versus physics. You could also say in terms of aspirations versus what's possible, aspirations versus the reality of economics. But before I talk about the physics and the underlying realities of what we think an energy transition is or might be, just a little bit of history. Sort of the modern energy transition quest, the whole idea began almost exactly 50 years ago. It was 50 years ago this quarter that the 73-74 Arab oil embargo hit the world, but directed at the United States. In this quarter, 50 years ago, this time of the year, 50 years ago, the price of oil went up 400%. So just to think in our terms, what would happen to our politics in the world if the price of oil went up 400%? If you think about that as a lesson, the problem with lessons of the past, obviously, is that we're different today, we're smart, we're modern, we got cell phones. I mean, 50 years ago, that's a long time ago. Cell phones were not roaming the earth. That picture you can see in the bottom left is the first Motorola portable phone, the infamous giant brick that you could carry around and use as a remote phone. And the United States at that time had gone from supplying 50% of the world's oil to 15% of the previous 50 years. So from 1924, the U.S. was half of all the world's oil. By 1974, it was 15%. Embargo hits. And the United States and Europe, the U.S. in particular, passed legislation and spent hundreds of billions of dollars for the next 50 years, trillions of dollars in inflation-adjusted terms, to replace and avoid using oil. It was the entire focus of all the legislation started with the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1974. And every single piece of legislation since has been focused on that, specifically replacing and avoiding oil. What happened over those 50 years, fast forward today, is that the world's production and consumption of oil went up by 12 billion barrels a year, which I would argue is a big number. So set history aside, and let me just frame, we'll call it the general philosophical nature of energy and how we need to talk about it from an underlying perspective that will inform how you think about what's possible in the future. But just fundamentally, there's only three things that determine the nature of everything that exists in the universe, to be purely philosophical, but certainly in society. And it's just three: energy, materials, and the information we have about energy materials. The only difference between how people lived in prehistory, the Neanderthal man, this is the exhibit at the Smithsonian, and modern man, the only difference is information. All the materials that exist then exist today. All the energy and forces that exist then exist today. There's nothing physically new except what we know about them and what we can do with the materials using energy to assemble atoms in different ways, to create different kinds of machines and different kinds of services with those machines. So it's a fundamental feature of civilization. In fact, if I were going to say, if aliens were watching the Earth, and there may even be aliens, I wanted to be an astrophysicist, I suspect there are aliens. But if they were watching Earth to detect whether there was intelligent life here, they would know there's life here because they would see from far away that we have water vapor and carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which is the essential elements that will make all plant life possible and thus all life possible. It wouldn't exist but for those two key elements, water and carbon dioxide. But that wouldn't be what the signal would matter to them. The signal would matter to them is they would detect emissions of artificial radiation, artificial light, and artificial radio waves. artificial light is a signal of a profound transformation of humanity. It's not chaotic light. It's very clearly artificial and manufactured light. And the photons that go in the RF spectrum are equally clearly invisible from space. If you could see in the radio spectrum, all of the communications that we do wirelessly just spew out into space. They're organized low entropy forms of energy production to acquire machines and knowledge to make the tools that make that possible. By the way, as a calibration point, the quantity of energy that we devote to artificial illumination today, we're now approaching the same quantity of energy devoted to radio waves, to the development of highly ordered information that is visible in, if you're an alien, looking at Earth's emanation of ordered logic in the radio frequency spectrum. That sort of the architecture of using ideas to create order out of nature to change what we can do is epitomized by illumination, not illumination we think of today, but it begins with the foundational forms of illumination that humanity had for most of written history, which is burning wood and burning natural oils, biological oils. The story of whale oil is sort of the epitome of what we want to happen all the time, everywhere, in the intersection of information, energy, and materials. You probably heard the line that the oil industry saved the whale. It's a common throwaway line. It's not true. Coal industry saved the whale. A chemist named Abraham Gesner in 1845 in Halifax, Nova Scotia, my homeland, so that's why I picked him, but he was the one who developed the technique for synthesizing kerosene out of coal in 1845. The graph you see in your bottom left is the total harvest of whale oil by the United States whaling industry over a period of a century. You'll notice that the whale harvest peaked in 1845. The oil industry did not appear for 50 years. The reason that the oil industry through coal displaced whales can be distilled to a very simple march of knowledge, how to do something using materials with ever greater efficiency. You could measure this in pounds, which is a more useful measure than in lumens, let's say. If you wanted to provide 4 hours of light per day, per year from a lamp, you had to harvest 1,000 pounds of whale to get enough oil. One lamp, 4 hours a day for the year, 1,000 pounds of whale. The incredibly inefficient process that Gesner invented to make kerosene by harvesting coal only took 300 pounds of coal. That told you immediately. It's easier to harvest coal than whales, and it's a third the weight. Ipso facto, this is obviously cheaper, it'll proliferate and replace the other. And then when Thomas Edison used copper and the idea of electricity and eventually tungsten, but other kinds of materials, it's a materials revolution, to make the Pearl Street Station, it dropped the quantity of coal needed to 100 pounds to produce exactly the same amount of illumination with a profoundly inefficient light bulb. As light bulbs got more efficient and steam engines got more efficient to make power through high temperature metals and knowledge about how to forge and make those materials, and pressures and temperatures went up, the amount of coal to produce the same amount of illumination per year dropped 10 pounds using a better light bulb, still an inefficient incandescent bulb, fast forward to the development of the LED, and it dropped to 1 pound of coal. If you use natural gas in a recuperated turbine, which also benefit from the advance of knowledge, classes of materials, you'd get to 2/10 of a pound of natural gas to get the exact same amount of illumination. So the energy efficiency of illumination in material terms and societal terms, environmental terms, got roughly 10,000 times better. The quantity of lumen supplied to the world went up more than 100,000 fold. That's exactly why it happened. It didn't happen because of some, we'll call it policy direction, but because of a profound increase in knowledge, understanding how to manipulate materials. That's the story of energy over all of time. In fact, the single most important accomplishment of the human race, arguably, is the profound reduction in the cost of energy for all purposes, or the amount of society's economy that is devoted to acquiring food and fuel. Food is energy for humans and their animals, and of course, fuel is part of getting the food. If you look back over the last 700 years and you look at different economies and the share of GDP dedicated to getting food and fuel, what you see is somewhere between 50 and 80% of all economies were tied up just getting food and fuel for survival. The advent of the hydrocarbon age collapsed that down to 15%. This is in relative terms, not only that's in absolute terms, because economies are bigger, it's an even more dramatic picture. It's obviously logarithmic. Why does that matter? It's beyond obvious. The money that's freed up is used for healthcare, for environmental protection, for education, for entertainment. You get wealth creation by the mere profound productivity advance in serving all the needs of society through higher and higher efficiencies in the phenomenology of manipulating the atoms that have always existed to make new kinds of machines and operate them differently. Because energy's evolved everything. We come back to the modern times and the creation of the Department of Energy. I mean, I've said this as a ham-handed joke for years. It's a lousy title. It's a Department of Everything. Everything involves energy. Everything involves energetics. There are no products, no services, nothing that doesn't exist without an adequate, reliable, and cheap supply of energy. It sounds like a tagline of a lobbyist to say that, but it is a fundamental truth of civilization. So the idea of studying energy in isolation as a source, the sun, or oil, or gas, or coal, is profoundly misleading. And what's more misleading and more challenging for people who study the field of energy, particularly what you might call unkindly dilettantes who are in the policy world, is that we don't have good metrics for measuring energy. It's just a difficult thing to measure. In fact, it's a very difficult thing to understand. One of the great physicists of the 20th century, Richard Feynman, has a terrific line in his lectures when he says that we really don't know what energy is. What did he mean by that? Well, this is what he meant. Imagine we measured everything like grain and gold with only one metric, tons. I don't have to tell you that a ton of gold has some different value than a ton of grain, but they both weigh a ton. We measure all forms of energy with the same unit, BTUs or physics equivalents. So we measure the random photons coming out of a wood fire with the same BTUs as we measure the organized low entropic photons coming out of a laser. We measure everything with BTUs. DOE, Energy Information Administration, measures everything with BTUs as if they're equivalent. To say they're equivalent is even more misleading than saying a ton of gold is like a ton of grain. Both will crush you if you get dropped on you. This is beyond obvious, but their economic utility is profoundly different. The other problem in the energy domains is that energy domains are dominated in the public policy space, at least, by economists. Most reporters report what economists say. And I like economists just fine, and I like lawyers just fine, but they have their individual utility function. But economists' forecasts about energy are anchored properly enough in what we're already using, looking at using a little better, improvements in whatever exists, and looking at growing economies and growing populations, and you make forecasts. What economists have never been able to do, ever, is predict what humans do and have done for all of history and will continue doing, is humans invent new ways to use energy. There was no energy used for cars before the invention of the car, self-evidently. No energy used for airplanes before the invention of the airplane. No energy used for pharmaceuticals before the invention of pharmaceuticals and polymers and chemistry. Similarly, computing. And over time periods from invention to instantiation as a useful product to our day, each of those, is by way of example, represent these quantities of energy in barrels of oil equivalent, with the caveat I said earlier about the units in themselves have a challenge. And that feature of the energy world is generally absent from all forecasts because it's hard to forecast new forms of demand. You can easily forecast behaviors of existing forms of demand. The other feature of energy markets, of course, and understanding them, is that you have to understand where energy is used and why. At a fundamental level, everything that exists, every product, every service, starts with a mine somewhere on Earth. Everything. Not some things, all things. You have to mine something. Mining requires energy. You can look at a mine and you understand why it uses energy. What's interesting is that the mining sector is 40% of the world's industrial energy consumption. And the relevance of that I'll get to in a minute in terms of the modern energy transition. The other thing you do once you mine the materials is you fabricate specific classes of synthetic materials, things that don't exist in nature, like most classes of polymers, like steel. Iron exists in nature, nickel, alloyed with iron, gives you steel. Semiconductors, the crystalline grade silicon. These are manufactured products. To manufacture those things from which we then build infrastructures itself takes energy. All the materials of the modern era collectively require 10 to 100 times more energy per pound to manufacture than the things of the pre-modern era, like modern versus pre-modern, I'd say pre-20th century, from 19th century back. The amount of energetics involved in making a pound of polymer is about 10-fold more than using wood. The energetics in using a pound of silicon is 100 times higher than a pound of steel. We obviously make a lot more steel than we do silicon, but the numbers, we manufacture silicon by the tens of thousands of kilotons a year. In energy equivalent terms, this is like megatons of steel manufacturing. Put in sort of reductionist, simplistic terms, that what that means is that every computer that's manufactured, laptop type of computer, smartphone, uses about a barrel equivalent of energy to manufacture. We manufacture 1 million of those a year. None of those were manufactured. Just the manufacturing of them consumes the equivalent of 1 million barrels of oil equivalent per year globally. And then you have to operate everything. And the operating part is kind of interesting. It's beyond obvious. You put gasoline in the car, fuel in an airplane, plug in a data center. But again, it's a calibration for the way the world goes and how things evolve. Every $1 billion of cars manufactured consumes $100 million of fuel a year. But $1 billion of aircraft manufactured consumes $250 million worth of fuel a year. And $1 billion of data centers, until now, consumed $800 million of electricity, fuel a year. But as you infuse them with AI, the number will double. Every $1 billion of data centers will now move towards nearly $2 billion of fuel per year. It's just locked into the system. But why would you build these things? Because they have everything about transportation. These are things I gave you, all transportation examples, are invented because they have high economic utility functions. So economists measure economic opportunities that are created by the invention of new classes of machines. And there's a lot of terrific data on this, and it's beyond obvious what you find because you can think of anecdotal examples. If you look back over history at the invention of different means of moving stuff, moving goods and people, and moving information, and we used to move all our information by things like horses and ships too. You can calculate and I have, the bit rate of a Pony Express. It's about 20 kilobits. If you measure how much information you carry in the letters, how fast they go across the country, and then you can do the energetics of the horse, and you can find out what the energy is per kilobyte of getting letters from the East Coast to the West Coast of the United States by Pony Express. Why would you do that if you could fly it, or if you could send it by fax, or then you could send it by email? What you see as economic opportunity arises as you increase the use function of all kinds of energy consuming things. Again, calibration point, the total consumption of energy to fly airplanes globally is roughly the same now as the total consumption of energy in the communications sector. The computing, communications, cloud sector is now equal to aviation and exceeding it. So if you change the cost of energy in the transport system, you change the cost of the goods you're transporting. So this is a classic graph. This is sort of locked into energy prices from a few years ago. But the share of a cost of a product that's transported, the energy cost is a share of the cost of the product. Ranges from about 20% to as low as a few percent, 5%. But if you double the cost of energy, even in the most lightweight products, you can increase the cost of the good by 10%. 10% called inflation in the Fed world. And energy costs doubling or not doubling is something that's pretty common in the energy world. So when you take all the things that I'm showing you in aggregate, and then look at the bigger question, which is what all policy analysis focus on, is the quantity of primary resources consumed to energize factories to make machines and energize the machines. What you find, and this is just going back to 1965, obviously the trends look the same over any time period you choose, but we'll just pick modern times. All forms of energy supply have risen, all forms. The ones that have risen the most are oil, gas, and coal. They're, of course, the ones that are in the crosshairs now of the modern energy transition, which I'll come to. But another sort of rule of thumb for you to have in your head is that that's the trend in the past. The trend for the future is dictated by setting aside the invention of new things that will consume energy, which I'll get to, some examples for you. Just on the existing things that use energy, just flying for vacation, flying for work, having a warm house or a cool house, all the things that we take for granted in the world of 1 billion wealthy people. You all know there's 6 billion other people in the world. If half of those people consume half as much energy per capita as Europe, and Europe uses half as much energy per capita as us. So put differently, if half of the world's energy poor consume 1/4 as much energy as Americans, that doubles the world's energy consumption. It doubles it. Do you think they want to live like that? It's iron law of reality. Faced with that, what most people say is, well, we'll make things more efficient. I mean, you remember the graph I showed you about whale oil. We did make things. We made illumination 10,000 times more efficient, and the consumption of lumens went up 100,000-fold. The problem with the efficiency argument, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but I do want to implant it because it's in everyone's head when you show them a graph of energy consumption rising. We'll make it more efficient. Making it more efficient is how you increase demand. It's not how you suppress demand. When you make it more efficient, you reduce the inputs, it makes the product you're producing cheaper, and that makes it more available to more people. Self-evident what you stated. You can see it in the data. If you look on your right at aviation sector, global aviation energy efficiency has improved something like 350% in just the last 25 years. It's a remarkable improvement. Global consumption of air miles has gone up 700%. Global computing energy efficiency, of course, has improved much more because computers are easier to make more efficient than airplanes because they follow different classes of physics laws. But computing efficiency roughly improved 5,000-fold, 5,000-fold in the last 50 years. The consumption of bits has gone up roughly 100,000-fold, and we're on track now to a 1,000,000-fold increase in bits consumption. All of it consumes energy. So I'll still look to sort of a rule of thumb, a rule of threes of everything that determines whether or not we have enough energy to supply all these machines, whether they're cloud machines, flying machines, building pharmaceuticals. The pharmaceutical industry consumes twice as much energy as global aviation and will outpace it in increased energy consumption because taking entropy out of chemicals to make drugs is one of the most difficult physics challenges that manufacturers have. There's just three things. You have to have actionable ideas. It's sort of a version of my first Venn diagram. You need the equivalent of that is you have to have actionable ideas. You have to know something. You have to have durable permissions. That's because all of primary energy sources that we'd like to access, whether it's wind or sun, oil, gas, or coal, are on somebody's land. You have to have permission to use that land, to build the machines, and put them on the land to get the energy. And then you need money. And of course, economists understand that because the more capital is involved, there's a real cost of capital. Cost of capital is in real economies is non-trivial. Moving capital expenditures forward by building more capital-intensive things has real costs because it takes capital in markets that can be used for other things like food, healthcare, environmental protection. So time of use of capital, that's the reason that we have interest rates. Time of use of capital sort of reflects that. So it's not about resources. So there's all this happy talk. We're going to run out of this or have that, or I can find this. The sun is free, it's always there, or there's lots of oil in Saudi Arabia. Completely irrelevant. And it's interesting. I just to be facetious, if you don't follow this, and again, as I mentioned, I wanted to be an astronomer when I was young. I was an amateur astronomer. I discovered they weren't hiring many astrophysicists, so I switched to semiconductors and built weapons and lasers and computer chips and stuff. But when we flew a probe by Titan, the largest moon of Saturn, what we discovered was that it rains natural gas on Titan. There are oceans and lakes of natural gas, of liquid natural gas. A lot of it out there. Academically interesting. It's utterly worthless to us. We have no means to go harvest that natural gas. I could have put up a picture, you've probably heard recently about the asteroid that has $50 trillion worth of minerals on it. It's true. It's true. It's completely irrelevant. I mean, it's a physical resource. We have no machines or capacity at all, at any price to get there. And if we tried to do it, we would spend infinite sums of money to try to harvest things, which would raise the cost of the things. And the ideas matter, but the ideas matter when they happen because ideas have to become actionable. Actionable ideas require instantiation of manufactured products, which takes time. And it takes decades, and it's always taken decades. So I put up 6 examples of ideas in the energy world that are profound in terms of their long-run implications. The discovery of fission, which wasn't, for those of you who don't know your physics history, it was from a woman, Lise Meitner, a German physicist, who should have gotten the Nobel Prize but did not. The deliberations of the Nobel Committee were released 50 years after that. They're released after, I think, or maybe 70 years. She was denied it because she was a woman, by the way, and because she was German. So it was a combination at that time. It was very political. Anyway, physicists know she had the idea. That's when we knew we could do fission with uranium. First useful nuclear power plants didn't show up for at least 20 years, and we're still struggling to make nuclear energy more than 2% of the world's energy. It's not easy. The first photovoltaic cell Bell Labs, 1954. We didn't get the scale of photoelectricity until 2010. The first lithium battery, the chemistry, famously Nobel Prize here at UT for good now, but before him was the Exxon chemist in 1977. Their work useful lithium batteries for 20 years. Gallium making the LED possible, Texas Instruments, right in your backyard, Nick Holyoke, and he did that as in 1963. LED lights at scale took 50 years. Rhenium alloying metals to make turbine blades single crystal was the biggest change in aviation efficiency in history. Profound. It was done by Pratt & Whitney. It took another 20, 30 years to enter the markets to make it manufacturable. Neodymium that makes powerful magnets made the modern wind turbine possible. There's 800 pounds of neodymium in every single big wind turbine. That's there because it makes the motors and the generators profoundly compact, profoundly efficient. So the ideas take time. So now we have an idea, I guess I call it the idea du jour, is that we are about to, are going to have another energy transition of the equivalence of what happened, let's say, with whale oil. And of course, the transition that's being talked about, pushed and mandated and money is being spent on is to abandon hydrocarbons, so-called fossil fuels. You know, I have to explain as an aside why I said so-called fossil fuels. You'll remember I told you that Titan, the moon of Saturn, it rains natural gas. Last I checked, dinosaurs didn't have space travel and go there to die to create natural gas. There is no plant life on Titan because it's near absolute zero. There is nothing there organic to turn into natural gas, except natural gas apparently is a natural phenomenon in the universe as opposed to a fossil fuel. And yes, methane is emitted from fossil decomposition. That's swamp gas, and it does exist. Anyway, so we're going to have an energy transition. And we're going to get rid of hydrocarbons. And we want to have a transition that looks something like this. This is the energy transition of how we fuel transportation. This is the total harvest in petajoules of fuel called grain to feed horses in the United States over the period of 200 years. And the new tech came along roughly 1900. That's called cars, burning oil, and the use of fuel for horses went away. What I could have drawn overlaid on this, taken over time, is the use of grain to fuel cars now through ethanol mandates. It's now equal to and greater than the use of grain to feed horses in the 19th century. But that's a modern artifice of politics. So the transition that's being imagined now in the transportation world is that electric vehicles, your new resident of Texas, Elon Musk, his acceleration of interest in those vehicles will spell the end of the age of oil, and it's a transition of this character. If you do the arithmetic, it's just arithmetic, you don't have to have an opinion on EVs or Elon Musk. If you replace all the world's vehicles with electric cars, you would displace about 12% of the world's oil. So it's a significant amount of oil, but it's not the end of the age of oil. Here's where the world is today after about $5 to $10 trillion of spending in 2 decades to avoid hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal. 80% of the world's energy still comes from oil, gas, and coal. 20% are renewables, which in general, superficial clickbait lexicon, is conflated with wind and solar because that's how everybody thinks. But when you break out the global renewables share, that 20 percentage points, wind and solar are roughly 3.5% of the world's energy. Nuclear power is about 2.5%. Wood, burning wood, the oldest source of energy known to humanity, is still triple the contribution of the world's energy supply than all the world's wind turbines and solar plants combined. Does that mean that wind and solar won't surpass wood? Of course not. Of course it will. That will be a transition of consequence, but it will require a tripling of the wind and solar contribution. And wood use is going up, by the way. A part of it because it's a very useful, cheap fuel for poor people. And part of it because of artifice of silly policies of Europe and the United States. If you co-fire wood with coal in Germany, it gets rated as a low carbon renewable source of energy. So as a consequence, the US exports epic quantities of pelletized pine to Europe to burn with coal plants, which is fine by me. I think it's great for the wood growers, but that's the way the world is today. That does not look like a transition. This is 20 years and $5 to $10 trillion of real spending, and that's where we are. This is not an accelerating transition. And in my world, where I do a lot of writing, not just used to do real science, now I do real writing. Words matter. The meanings of words matter. This is not a transition. This is not an accelerating transition. The question that, one other quick thing before we get to this is US wood consumption, by the way. Because you're talking a lot of poor countries using wood. The red line is the absolute consumption of wood in America since 1760, and the blue line is per capita consumption. We've decreased the share of wood in America, but in absolute terms, today, for heating, not building buildings, we're using as much wood today for heat as we did in 1824. Who knew? Now, people who study energy know, but it just tells you something about the challenge of transitions. We haven't transitioned away from burning wood in America. We just added a lot of other stuff on top of burning the wood, which has been good. And this is one way of looking at it. This comes from a really good writer and actuary named Gail, who publishes a lot on this stuff. But she just mapped out the obvious thing you'd want to map out if you think about growing populations. And looking at recent history, last 40 years, the per capita consumption of oil, just for all purposes, per capita consumption of coal and gas. This is it for the world. All the stuff in the world averaged together. Again, you're not seeing a transition here. The only thing here that's remarkable is that coal went up a lot in the early 21st century, stabilized, shrinking a little bit, and natural gas is sort of the ascendant global fuel. And it will stay that way even if we have the spending on the green visions that are imagined by the International Energy Agency. This is their forecast for what are called announced pledges, APC, the stated energy plans, STEP, and of course, history. And the bottom three bars are hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal. If the world does what the IEA would like the world to do to accelerate the quote, transition away from hydrocarbons, spend trillions of dollars, not a few trillion, hundreds of trillions of dollars avoiding hydrocarbons. In the year 2050, this is the IEA forecast, we still get half of our energy from hydrocarbons in absolute terms. So I guess the question, if you're a geopolitical analyst, you'd want to know, since that's half the world's energy, who's supplying it and at what price? Because that's half the world's energy. It's 80% today, but it'd still be half in this model. As an example of how hard it is to transition away from hydrocarbons, we could take a micro example in the sense that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia triggered a desire to transition away from one specific fuel, natural gas, from one specific country, Russia, by Europe. There was a lot of happy talk about building more wind turbines and more renewables. What actually happened is that they use a lot more natural gas and they use a lot less energy. So they begun to deindustrialize, almost literally. Their economies contracted, so that causes reduction in energy consumption, and world's LNG supply chains shifted. US LNG, because it was available, went to Europe. Russian gas went to Pakistan, India, and China. And Russian oil went there too, by the way. So Russian oil that was embargoed from going to Europe instead went to Indian refineries, but was turned into diesel fuel and bought by the Europeans for a very high margin for the Indian refineries because they're being spanked for having been very bad people. And as a consequence, the oil sells at a discount to the Indians, but it doesn't sell as diesel fuel to Europe at a discount. It's incredible arbitrage. But from a physics perspective, when Germany built in 9 months a new LNG terminal, 9 months, a $2 billion LNG terminal, from announcing it to commissioning it. This is the crowd at the commissioning of, so it's an LNG tanker coming in. If they had chosen to build wind turbines instead of the $2 billion LNG terminal, they would have had to build $60 billion of wind turbines and still import gas to moderate the wind turbines' inability to produce power 24/7, or build batteries. This is giving you context of scale in the real physics of energy. They would have had to build $20 trillion of batteries to store 1 month's worth of energy from those wind turbines in order to replicate 1 month of gas storage from the gas caverns. Or put in Tesla terms, one LNG tanker's 4 million Teslas worth of energy stored.
Those are good for the US, right?
This was that?
Germany finds those.
Most of their thing, like, well, I think Qatar too. I think Qatar is the second, and some from Australia. The three big dogs in LNG are US, Qatar, and Australia. So now, but nonetheless, the LNG PowerPoint, and I will use the unkind word fantasy, is that we're going to go to zero hydrocarbons on global grids by 2050, 2100. This is a construction problem, never mind the money problem. We'll get to the money in a second. To go from where the world is today, in the share of all of the world energy that's not from burning hydrocarbons, just shy of 20%, by 2050, to give you a sense of the construction program that's required, never mind the cost, that would require building and installing every single day 1,000 3-megawatt wind turbines. Each of those is the size of the Washington Monument. You have to build and install 1,000 a day, every day for 30 years. And that's the construction program that's represented by this. Or you could build one new nuclear plant, 1 gigawatt plant, every day for 30 years. And we're building them in the United States at the rate of 1 a decade. And in China, they're building, they're probably 5 a year, 6 a year now, not 1 a day. This is a form of materials fantasy. We don't have the construction capacity to do those kinds of things to the planet, nor do we have the money. This is a Bloomberg New Energy Finance look at trailing spending on transition, now pushing past $2 trillion a year to get the plans announced, not to get to the zero. We have to jump beyond $6 trillion a year. None of this is appropriated. None of this is planned. This is what it will require. Or put differently, $200 to $300 trillion will have to be spent on doing exactly the same things that are already being done with 1/10 that money, which in economist terms, it's inflationary. In productivity terms, it's the antithesis of productivity. The bigger challenge isn't just money, and this is the challenge we'll hit first, because we could just print money, which is sort of what's going on. You could print trillions of dollars a year. That has another effect in economics, obviously. It devalues the money, but governments have done that. What they can't do is they can't print concrete. They can't print steel. They can't print. You can print stuff with steel in 3D printers, but you can't print the atoms of iron. You've got to have them. So if you look at the underlying materials requirements for the transition aspirations, you have to look at 2 classes of materials: common materials, concrete, steel, and glass, typically, and how much more material do you need to build wind and solar arrays versus combustion turbines. You got to build a machine that delivers a unit of energy. You have to build the machines. We know this is not complicated. This is engineering 101. Every contractor, constructor knows what you have to build. It's roughly 1,000% increase in the common materials per unit of energy delivered to society. So for every unit of light in this room, for every unit of hour of computing use, every pound of pharmaceuticals produced, we'll have to increase the use and acquisition use of common construction materials by 1,000% in the supply chain to do it. That's doable, by the way. Iron is the most common element other than silicon across the earth. Lots of iron out there. It just takes energy to get it. So I'm not doing the energetics in this. This is just tons, back to tons. The bigger problem with the green aspirations, batteries, windmills, and solar arrays, is that they involve far more minerals, what the IEA is calling critical energy minerals. Obviously lithium for lithium batteries, but nickel and molybdenum, neodymium for the motor generators, and especially aluminum and copper. Copper is a long pole in the tent when it comes to electrification. Copper is fundamentally non-substitutable. That is, 90% of the uses for copper, there are other things you could use. If you don't use copper, you don't do the thing. That's not true in high voltage transmission. Aluminum can be used at extremely high voltages, and in extremely expensive applications you can make superconductors, but by and large, copper is not substitutable. And copper is the oldest mined metal. So if you study economic history, what you'll learn is the first industries, not the first professions, but the first industry was mining. It predates written history. We've been mining copper, and copper was the first metal mined, as it turns out. Copper is really, really old specialty metal. We know a lot about it. We also know this, that to build wind, solar machines and batteries, you use far more of all the critical energy minerals, in particular of copper. But 300 to 400% more copper per electric car versus conventional car. That's because your drivetrain is a copper electric bus bar, the motor is one with copper wires, and the battery has copper cathode. So you need about 400 to 500% more critical minerals per car to build electric cars. You need 1,000% to 2,000% more minerals per machine compared to conventional combustion machines. Or put in sort of car terms, because it's a better way to visualize it. One electric car's battery, which weighs about 1,000 pounds, requires mining on Earth somewhere about 500,000 pounds of the Earth to produce the refined minerals to make that one battery. The number could be 250,000 pounds in some mines. It's closer to 1 million pounds in most mines that are aggregated around the world. Minerals exist in small quantities in the rocks that we target, fractions of percent, if you're lucky. And you actually build more materials than you think if you just do this at scale. If you have wind and solar as a few percent of the grid, Texas is sort of pushing the limit of what you can do with any degree of reliability because of the fact that the source is variable beyond obvious. I don't mean that the wind stops blowing. I mean that the amount of wind that you get over time seasonally varies. It's not just the sunrise and sunsets. Everybody knows that. It's the amount of sun that's insolent on the surface of the Earth changes seasonally. And this is very well-known data. On the right is the annual incidence of sun in California. It varies by twofold. Same is true for wind. What that means is that when you thought you had to build one wind turbine or one solar array, you had to build two to take into account seasonal variability. And then you have to store energy for regular occurrence of what are called wind or solar droughts. A solar drought is cloud cover for a long time. A wind drought is no wind for a long time. We have reliable meteorological data that shows over the time periods we build grids, they're run for 30 years. We have dozens of occurrences of nationwide wind and solar droughts, and some occurrences of simultaneous becalming of the entire continent of the United States with no wind at the surface and no sun. So you'd have to plan grids around that. If you wanted to think in terms of what that would cost for the aspirations, sort of the PowerPoint plans for the future, and use batteries for 1 day of drought on the continental United States, you'd have to build $4 trillion of batteries, assuming the battery prices are what they're forecast to become. It's a lot of batteries. The problem with using episodic power to supply society is that you have to build, again, more capacity to get the same energy. Obviously, more capital, more machines. If you build more capacity to get the same energy, then that means the capital efficiency is degrading. You can measure that with a simple measure called the capacity factor of the energy machines. And we can do the average for the entire world's energy machines. The average capacity factor for all energy machines combined in the world is 50%. That is, you spend $1, it produces energy on average half the time. The average capacity factor for all renewable machines, which includes hydrodams and biofuels, is about 40%. But as you notice where this graph starts to really start drop off around the year 2010, that says the world's additions of wind and solar, which have average capacity factors of 20 to 30%, are dragging the whole world's capacity factor down. This is, put differently again in economic terms, this is increasing the cost of energy or decreasing the capital efficiency of building energy machines, which reverses the centuries-long trend of decreasing the amount of capital being devoted to supplying food and fuel. So the answer to this is often the hand wave, well, it's always windy somewhere sometimes, it's always sunny somewhere sometimes. So you build enough transmission lines, and let's just set aside that it has costs and it has material requirements. Just stipulate, you could build them, it's just money, and metals and materials, you could build them. So if you model the entire continent of the United States as being fully integrated with the transmission lines, and you're gonna run it on wind and solar, so that it's always windy somewhere sometime, always sunny somewhere, with the sun. And you store stuff, you still have to store stuff because it's still dark over the whole continent of the United States for some time period. How much storage would you need? How big would the grid have to be? It's actually not a complicated model. So if you assume that you would use a grid only 4 times bigger than we have today, only, so 400% increase in CapEx, we build a grid 4 times bigger, fully integrated, you still need 4 days of storage of batteries to avoid turning the country off in black. 4 days of, it's roughly $2 trillion per day of storage, or magnitude. So this is $8 trillion of batteries, which wear out, by the way. If you use them like this, they don't last 30 years. They may last a decade. So the real number is the 2 trillion per day, 4 days, 12 trillion, times 3, be 30 trillion. You can imagine better technology. It's not so easy. The technology of energy storage is, again, another piece of physics. It's deeply fascinating. Lots of ways to store energy. But if you draw a graph, a logarithmic curve about the amount of time you want to store the energy, how many days of storage would you like of gas, oil, or coal, or electricity, and how big the grid is, or the grid is your phone, I want 1 day of storage. Obviously, that's a little different than a grid. And what you find is that when you go to the top right of the curve, where society operates grids, there are very few options for storing energy at scale, at all. Batteries fall in the sort of the center, where you can get megawatt hours and you can get hours and sometimes a day, you can do that. But society needs to operate. The nature of our energy infrastructure in the Western world is such that there's between 1 and 3 months of energy fuel in storage at any given time. That's the rough structure of the market. Not days, not minutes, not hours, but months. But we're still going to build a lot of batteries. That's the Inflation Reduction Act, which the proponents of it admitted after they passed it was the Green New Deal. In fact, bragged about it as well. Not an invective. They said we got the Green New Deal passed. It's Christmas for climate tech, and here we go. So the EIA is forecasting that we're going to build lots of grid scale batteries. True. If we actually build them, they measure it in gigawatts which is really, sounds big, because a gigawatt, gig is a billion. I just put where 3 hours occurs. So we're going to get to, after hundreds of billions of dollars, 3 hours of storage, not 3 months, 3 hours of storage. Grids operate over decades with the capacity to have a month of energy. And to build all the stuff, and we'll come back to my materials, you have to mine it. So what you'd want to know if you're a forecaster or analyst to ask the question of whether we can actually achieve this as we spend the money, is the world mining enough copper, and enough nickel, enough lithium, enough cobalt, enough manganese, enough graphite, enough aluminum? Electric cars use far more aluminum than a regular car because your fuel tank, instead of weighing 70 pounds, weighs 1,000 pounds. So the way you keep the wheel weighing 1,000 pounds more than a regular car is you put a lot of aluminum in the car. Aluminum is extremely energy intensive, as you probably know. That's why we recycle aluminum. But you don't get to recycle it if your car lasts 10 years. You have to make that new aluminum. You have to expand the world's aluminum mines. This is a map of the historic global capital spending by the world's mining industries. That's the red bars. The red bars show you what the announced plans are to the year 2030. This is announced plans or plans to expand mines. So, because it takes 10 years to 20 years to open a mine, anybody that's going to open a mine in 2030 has announced it because they're building it now. The green hash bars are what you need to meet the aspirations to build the electric vehicles that are being planned, never mind everything else. Put differently, as BlackRock pointed out, I like the euphemism. It's not just that the metals and materials demand will surpass all prior estimates, is that it'll be, quote, impeded by the lack of materials. Impeded by. If you don't have the copper, you're not going to build it. It's not an impediment. It's impeded something you can overcome it by just trying harder. It's not available. It won't get built. What will happen is the market will start bidding copper, and the copper prices will go up. In fact, the president of Ivanhoe Mines said that in the bidding war that's coming, if it happens, as we keep trying this, the price of copper could go up tenfold. That's the biggest single sustained price increase in copper, which will impact building construction, appliances, all kinds of things. So the folks at S&P IHS Markets forecast two things. We have the stated increase in EV sales, that's the red line, and we're being told by 2030 EV sales will match internal combustion engine sales. That will require copper, because again, 400 pounds more per EV compared to a regular car. And what that will do globally, because everybody's trying the same thing, is that the world will go from small oscillations of a global copper deficit to permanent copper famine. So that's the deficit growing. If the chart on the right happens, the chart on the left has to happen. So you have sort of incommensurate forecasts. You have underinvestment in copper mines, and you have overenthusiasm for using copper. Meanwhile, while we're doing this, we can look at who's doing the refining of the copper, because once you mine it, like oil, you have to make it into gasoline. Copper has to be refined. You'd want to know who's refining the energy minerals. This is getting a lot of publicity now. First time I pointed these things out, maybe 5 years ago in Senate testimony, it was greeted by sort of doe eyes that can't be true. Well, the data is now covered by the International Energy Agency. So all the red bars are China's share of global copper refining, global nickel refining, global aluminum, cobalt, lithium, rare earths, all the components that go into batteries. Somewhere between, at the low end, 50%, the high end, 90% of the critical energy minerals are refined in China, not here. And so no matter how elliptical we do the sourcing requirements, a lot of it's going to come from China, period. We could replace it by building refineries here and mines. That'll take time. China's market, by time I mean decade or 2 decades, because they've been at it for 2 decades. China's market share in energy minerals is double OPEC's market share in oil. So again, go back to geopolitics. It would be profoundly naive to think that they'll never exercise in some fashion market power. They'd be crazy not to. They haven't so far. They've sent some signals. Meanwhile, in America, we're spending money to buy the stuff that's being refined in China, which is, I'm actually a free trade guy. As you heard, I worked for Reagan, so I got imprinted like the ducklings and the story. I like trade. I think it's great. It's good for the world. But there are geopolitics that come in. And meanwhile, in America, right now, last fall, the president of the Trade Association for the U.S. Mining pointed out, and you can find the testimony online, but he itemized all the things that are being done by this administration in the mining sector, by BLM, by the Council of Environmental Quality, by EPA. Everything that's being done is making mining harder and more expensive to operate at all or to open a new mine in the United States. We are not making it easier to mine and refine here. We're actually actively making it harder. And that's happening globally. It's, the global movement that's opposing mines is growing strength in some of the global NGOs. Like, as an example here, sort of pun intended, the canary in the mine in Panama, one of the biggest copper mines in the world, is now shut down because on October the 27th, the Panamanian government announced that they weren't going to approve the expansion permit for the mine after all to meet the demand because they thought that the mining company, a Canadian company called First Quantum Minerals, publicly traded, they ought to be paying higher wages to the workers, and maybe some money should come to the government of Panama. A set of what they call equity issues that may all be valid, fair enough, but the mine is now shut down. The stock price cratered immediately, and to say this might possibly discourage other mining companies from investing billions of dollars in a new copper mine in regions where this could happen would be, again, profound understatement. But even if they do, the International Monetary Fund looked at the net demand of copper, the way I showed you earlier, and the net demand to nickel, net demand to aluminum and molybdenum. They did a multi-factor study, a regression analysis looking back, looking forward, because we know lots about mineral prices and mineral price commodities. What will the demand for minerals do to the price of minerals as we keep pushing this goal of funding through deficit spending a, quote, energy transition? It's a good study, didn't get a lot of attention. This is one of their, so if you leave things alone, the bottom of that range is sort of where copper and nickel prices go. If you push the energy transition, the top of the range is where it goes. Or put in their language, the world would face a mineral price inflation greater than any in the last century and for a longer period than any experienced in the last century. Mineral price inflation happens all the time from this balance of supply and demand. But if it continues, this will happen, and it will last. In their words, it will last for a decade. So a decade of mineral price inflation would reverse, just like the graph I began with, where I showed you the percentage of an economy that's associated with food and fuel, which has collapsed because of the hydrocarbon age, and only because of the hydrocarbon age and the addition of intelligence and knowledge to manipulation of materials using the energetics of hydrocarbons. It's what's happened. The other miracle of history is that it gets harder and harder to mine minerals and create the commodities that we all use, not just food, but metals. This is the real long-run 200-year price for a basket of global commodities. And you can see that there's oscillations, but the long-run trend is, this is an incredible achievement. Just to have the quantity of minerals the world consumes. The world consumes stuff you can measure in tons again. But the world consumes 100 gigatons of stuff, food, metal, and fuel, a year, 100 gigatons. 20 or 30 years ago, it was 60 gigatons. 40 years before that, it was 20 gigatons. And yet the price of the stuff that feeds it all is going down. This is a miracle of technology. To solve the minerals problem that will be created by pursuing wind, solar, and batteries, well, reverse that. It will reverse the long-run trend because of price pressure, unless we come up with new technology. Because if I made a magically new battery that was 10 times more energy efficient than Elon Musk's lithium battery, it obviously would use 1/10 as much material. That solves the problem. Technology does solve problems over time. If you remember the first graph I showed you, though, there's a timeline between the idea and it being instantiated as a product. The timeline is measured in decades, not years, for phenomenological changes, not subtle changes, not what's called Wright's law changes, that is economies of scale and manufacturing efficiency bring you incremental changes in declining cost. You need phenomenological changes. So I'll give you an example of the sort of comic book language that's being used to talk about energy tech as exponentially changing the game. People are invoking the revolution in computing and communications as the example of how you get exponential change. This is called a category error. There's no relationship between the physics of information and the physics of producing energy at scale. They're incommensurate domains. They aren't that same magisterium. It's like comparing engineering to theology. They are not the same magisterium. But people say silly things. International Monetary Fund, to pick on one of many. Smartphone substitution seemed no more imminent in the early 2000s than large-scale energy substitution. They meant energy tech today. So there's a graph for you just to give you a sense of the physics we're talking about. The energetics of oil, the underlying energy value of oil before you do anything with it, is roughly 10,000 watt-hours per kilogram. The underlying energy value of lithiated chemicals, depending on the lithiated chemicals, is 1,000 to 2,000 watt-hours per kilogram. That's before you build machines to make it work. That's the maximum you can get if you have, you have no inefficiencies in nature, which always exist. It's a gap of 5,000%. It's in the physics of the universe we live in that doesn't get closed by innovation. You're going to do something different. Maybe we'll discover dark energy and room temperature superconductivity, but you're not going to close this gap with subsidies. You don't close this gap with invoking market forces. That gap is locked into the physics of the universe we live in. People who invoke exponential change in energy tech are saying comic book things like Iron Man's energy pack here. That'd be a cool energy pack to have. I mean, the energy density to fly a human being like Iron Man is doable, by the way. There's a French engineer who did that. He flew across the English Channel. I thought it was pretty cool. Nobody gave him any publicity. On a like a hoverboard that was only about 3 feet across, he flew across the English Channel by himself on a hoverboard. He stood on. He had to land halfway, so he got. And it went. I think he had 150 miles an hour, so he could fly for 5 minutes by himself. 10 miles in the middle of the channel, had a barge there, refueled it for the other 10 minutes, got there. Pretty cool. But it's not Iron Man going supersonic. All energy machines have physics limits, so invoking exponential change is silly. This is the underlying physics of energetics of wind turbines. What you see in this graph, this is the 6 kinds of wind turbines there are. All that matters in this graph is they all have limits. As the wind speed goes up, as the turbines get bigger, they get better, and then they fall off. As wind speeds go higher, wind turbines lose efficiency. There's a Goldilocks zone for where wind turbines work. We're in the Goldilocks zone. They're not going to get significantly better. Same is true for solar photovoltaics. National Research Energy Labs publishes this great graph of the dozens of materials that exhibit the incredible phenomenon of photons becoming electrons. The phenomena, the photoelectric effect, for which is what Einstein got the Nobel Prize for. That's what his. What you see, the common denominator here is that everything hits a limit and asymptote. This is time. It gets invented, it gets better, and then it stops getting better because they all hit physics limits. They have different physics limits depending on the material, how much you want to pay for it. For the materials that society can afford, silicon-based photovoltaic cells are right in the middle of this range, and they can get a little better yet. The best silicon photovoltaic cells are 27% efficient. The physics limit's 32%. There's no amount of money that can change that. But as you inflate the costs of capital, if you inflate the cost of materials, the steel and the iron, which is what we're doing now, and the cost of the other minerals, you end up making the machines you build, photovoltaic machines or wind turbines, more expensive, not cheaper. This is the real world cost of solar and wind. These are the contracted costs that are being deployed in the United States since, what did I put this one back to? 2018. So we got 10, 15, 14 years. This is not a curve of radically declining costs. This is a curve of continually rising costs. The continuously rising costs come from the fact that we were near physics limits 10 years ago in the machines. So all the costs of the machines are now tied up in permissions, land, you spend money for, concrete, copper, selenium and minerals, and the associated energy costs of the manufacturing. Give you another example of hyperbole, sort of violating, I would call common sense, but also just behavioral dynamics in global energy markets. In 2019, the IEA forecast lots more electric vehicles will be built. They were right. There's now 30 million in the world, half are in China. And they forecast in 2019 that was peak gasoline consumption in the world. It would never see that level of consumption again. It did collapse during the great lockdowns because we told people to stay home and we punished them if they didn't. So it worked. That's a pretty big decline. I mean, in percentage terms, it's actually remarkably small. Think about it. You're going, just look at the numbers. You don't. It's collapsed because on a relative basis, it's pretty scary. But the black line, the blue line is the forecast from IEA. The black line is the actual gasoline consumption. So now with 30 million vehicles that didn't exist 10 years ago, electric vehicles. The world this year surpassed record levels of gasoline consumption on the planet. You're also being told, ignoring the physics of materials that I showed you, we're doing this, we're subsidizing EVs to eliminate oil is to cut CO2 emissions. Beyond obvious, this is about cutting CO2 emissions. It's also beyond obvious that electric vehicles don't have a tailpipe. But electric vehicles emit carbon dioxide when they're being built, that's before they are used, and when they're parked, they get refueled. And I'm not referring here so much to the joke that Teslas run on coal, which is true in China, because if you charge a Tesla at night in China, you're charging with coal. If you charge it at night in Norway, you're charging with a hybrid van. It just depends where you are. So when you look at the actual life cycle of CO2 emissions from vehicles, what you see is you count the emissions from making the thing, that's before the zero line, and then running the thing on real grids. With gasoline, we know exactly how much emissions occur because gasoline emissions are the same no matter where you burn the gasoline. Making a battery, the emissions from the energy to get the minerals depends on where the minerals are mined, beyond obvious, and where they're refined. So you see graphs like this that are published all the time that show, in this case, you have to drive a small Volkswagen 60,000 miles before the electric Volkswagen emits less CO2 than the petrol one, the diesel one. So you can make the battery better, sure, more efficient, but here's the real problem. If you actually model this based on where minerals are mined, the emissions from real mineral mines and real refineries, what you find is that the range of emissions from an internal combustion engine, bottom one is a more efficient internal combustion engine, life cycle emissions 25 tons. The green line are the range of possible, not highest, but possible in the existing structure of the world, emissions from first building the battery emits more CO2 than the internal combustion engine car emitted over its operating life. The future will make the technology better. Sure, the batteries will be more energy dense and use less material, but what's also happening in the future is ore grade through. Materials are declining. This is declining. Ore grades have been declining for centuries. Copper ore grades are typically 0.2%. They're going to 0.1%. Means you dig up twice as much of the earth to get the same pound of copper. What you'd want to know again here, if you're making forecasts, and the forecasts are not done this way, which is intellectually dishonest, what will the marginal energy emissions be for the next marginal ton of copper I need to build the next vehicle? We know the answer to that because we have lots of mines at different copper grades. That's the graph on the right. There's a sort of a best fit line, which is kind of cute, but except it's silly because the real data show it's logarithmic, not linear. As you decrease ore grades, the cost of energy goes up non-linearly compared to the actual, So what's happening in these domains is that the IEA and others are saying, well, we'll cut carbon dioxide emissions by changing people's behaviors. And by that they mean, this is one of their graphs, you will fly less. You will be told to fly less, induced to fly less, or mandated to fly less. We'll cap business flights and have them cap them, meaning capping them at 2010 levels for the year 2030 or 2050. Then you have to shift to rail, take fewer vacations, you have to fly less for business. They also are promoting the need that we have to change home behaviors. Homes have to be colder in the winter, warmer in the summer, less heat, and they also have promoted aggressively clotheslines to replace clothes dryers because obviously a clothesline is more energy efficient than a clothes dryer. These kinds of behavioral things are cultural, social things. They're not physics things. I'll happily take the bet with anybody 2-1 on your favor that this stuff won't happen. I mean, you could try it, but none of the stuff is going to happen. People will go crazy. I'm not going to let them do this. The other one in cars is, of course, ban internal combustion engines. They've done that, but I'll take the bet how long those bans last. And require ride sharing and lower the speed limit. Eco sharing. This is all eco sharing. Again, these are behavioral things that there's possible some states or some places might be happy with. I doubt it'll happen in America. Meantime, what we're doing in America is we're reshoring manufacturing. So the total capital spending in manufacturing construction is taken off. That's the top line. Every manufacturing plant needs energy, and particularly it needs electricity in the modern era. The little red circle is the total capital spending in the electric sector to supply net new energy. That's what you would call an incommensurate trend. Something will happen, we'll see. And we're spending a lot more money on artificial intelligence, which is my favorite energy technology subject, because the world is spending a lot. In fact, if you look at the axis, if you look at dollars, U.S. is spending now something on the order of $85 billion a year on manufacturing, and the U.S. is spending something on the order of privately $80 billion a year on AI. That's a lot of money. AI, artificial intelligence, is the most energy-intensive use of silicon ever. There's a lot of ways to explain why that's the case, but essentially, when you run a chip on AI, what you're doing is you're running the chip flat out. You're doing the equivalent of the chip of comparing the fuel consumption of a car the way you use it, which is in your garage, and typical out of the 87, 60 hours a year, you might drive your car 500 hours. It's a typical duty cycle. If you run the car 87 to 60 hours a year, it uses a lot more fuel. Silicon chips for AI run nonstop, 87 to 60 hours a year. Most computing loads are like car loads. They run episodically, 500 hours, 200 hours, 1,000 a year. So what's going on is we're building up the information infrastructure, data centers in Ireland are already 1/5 of all Irish country's electricity. They've banned new data center construction unless the data center builds its own power plant. They're not building solar plants. They're funding them in other countries, but they're building gas turbines to do this. Data centers are being built at the rate of 20 million square feet of data centers a year. So global construction of skyscrapers runs at about 2 million square feet a year. Data centers cost as much as skyscrapers to build. We're building 20 million square feet a year, and they use 100 times more power per square foot. So I'll leave you with a couple of backward thoughts. I came back to information because information matters, but our information engines are now become one of the biggest vectors for new energy demand in the world. If you look at three vectors for energy consumption, in this case electricity, electric vehicles, the cloud, and illumination. Illumination is the oldest. Actually, EVs are pretty old too. Studebaker was the biggest electric vehicle manufacturer up until the year 1912, and they shut down their electric vehicle production line. It was irony. It was 100 years later that the Tesla S was introduced. So they've been around for a while. EVs use about roughly 1/10 as much electricity globally as a global cloud, and the global cloud, especially with AI, is expanding rapidly. And it's expanding not because data centers want to use electricity. It's because they're providing something to society that has high utility function. If you, setting aside deep fakes and the toys and games you can play with ChatGPT and DALL-E and a lot of fun stuff, in the real world where AI has been used for years, it provides productivity. That's why businesses use AI engines, especially ones made it to what you call physics engines. So we should expect a productivity boom. I think we're going to get a productivity boom this next 5 years. That's a big deal. I mean, it'll be great for the economy. Whoever's the president will get credit for it. Nothing to do with the president. It's just will be an exogenous factor. It'll also increase electricity use in the data centers. That's whatever. But a productivity boom means more wealth. More wealth means more people will be taking vacations and flying more. They'll be building more airplanes, driving more cars. I don't care whether they drive a Tesla or they drive an F-150. It takes energy to build them and run it. Energy use goes up and productivity goes up. So we're going to have material increases in the legal sense in energy demand just because of productivity gains. We'll also have new exogenous reasons that are discontinuities in what we invent to build to do things that will also consume energy to manufacture, consume energy to use. We're not going to have a transition. Well, I put the transition from internal combustion engine to EVs is not a transition; it's an addition. There's going to be lots more of both. That's what's happening. That's what will happen. Changing how you fuel a car, to be trivially simplistic, but I think accurate, is roughly equivalent in the history of economic impacts from technology as changing the food for horses in the 19th century. It'd be germane where you got the food, but it's still a horse. It's still a car. And its economic utility functions is the same. Revolutions and things like robots, by robot I don't mean bolted down machine that welds things in auto factories, but anthropomorphic rolling, semi-autonomous and fully autonomous robots. Stuff of science fiction, no longer science fiction. Elon Musk has been saying it for the last year. He thinks his robot division will be worth more than his cars in years to come. I think he's right. I think it's going to take a while, but I think he's right. But robots require energy to build. They are astonishingly energy intensive to manufacture. They actually invert the car in a sense. The car uses 80% of its energy driving. It takes 20% of its life cycle energy to build. A robot will consume 80% of its energy fabricated and still use energy to operate because robots eat too. I mean, they gotta be fueled. And the more work they do, the more they're going to eat. And they'll eat electricity, of course, and they'll swap their battery packs out. They'll do all kinds of cool stuff. But they'll be robots and they'll be productivity machines. And to tell you that this is not sort of fantasy, last year was the first time 1 million mobile robots were shipped in the market for the first time. Manufactured, semi-autonomous or fully autonomous mobile robots, 1 million of them. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot more than zero. And it's going to be on an asymptote because most of them are being shipped, by the way, into the supply chain market dominated by warehouses. And 2/3 or 3/4, well, maybe 90% are wheeled so far. But the walking bots exist, and there are several commercial ones. Anthropomorphic walking dogs, you've seen Boston Dynamics Spot, and Agility Robotics in Oregon is building a 2-legged anthropomorphic robot for warehouse use. So I'll end with the discontinuities that no one counts, they're hard to count, that have profound implications for the future are the same as in the past. when a genius comes up with a new idea, they understand something about materials in a way that is phenomenologically different than anything in the past, it can change the game, create new kinds of products and services. And there's all kinds of stuff that's already been imagined, not so much reduced to practice or about to be reduced to practice. In sort of, if you sort of scour the pantheon of clever things, from transient electronics, that is computer chips that disappear after they've done their job. So that'd be sensors that you put in the environment or you could eat. Nanoparticles have been around as an idea forever. Carlo Sergi invented a way to make lithiated nanoparticles that would functionally be the equivalent of a battery would be a liquid tank. Put a liquid fuel with lithiated nanoparticles in the tank, and when you finish consuming the electricity from lithiated nanoparticles, you just drain it out and put new liquid fuel in. So it'd be a 5-minute refill the way a gasoline is. It'd be a big deal. It would change electric cars a lot. It's going to take a while to get there. There's a range of things that have comparable implications. Thermal photovoltaics have always been imagined. They've always existed. They're incredibly inefficient. This is a photovoltaic cell that makes electricity instead of from visible light, from heat. If you could make a thermal photovoltaic cell 10 times more efficient, and that's what Henry did, you could surround every heat engine with thermal photovoltaic cells if it's cheap, and profoundly increase the thermodynamic efficiency of that machine, of the combustion machine. Really quite remarkable. The last one I threw here is not his invention. It's the CEO of a company called Halo. They make Halo fuel. This is high assay, low enriched uranium. This is a class of uranium fuel. It's a pellet, silicon carbide, graphite that allows one to make nuclear power plants the size of a semi-trailer and produce as much electricity as a megawatt, basically, a megawatt electric semi-trailer. Pretty big deal, not theoretical. So I end with this sort of macro observation, and this was sort of the thesis that was in my recent book. The ideas about about materials and about energy are what animates all the things that we build. And a century ago, we were at an interesting inflection, roughly the 1920s, in 3 domains: the underlying materials, the nature of information systems, and the nature of machines that we use to build and operate everything. There were revolutions going on because of the constellation of knowledge that had advanced in the previous 2 decades. That's when automobiles became practical, aviation became practical, electric power plants became practical, deployed at scales, when metal alloys became practical at scales, from polymers to chemical industry. Pharmaceuticals began in the material space. That's when we had the maturation of telephony and the radio, and the literal professionalization of science, which is, in my view, the foundational information tool. That convergence happened simultaneously, and that's what propelled the entire 20th century. That was the revolution of a 700-fold increase in real wealth over the 20th century. It utterly collapsed abject poverty around the world. I think we're at the same pivot points. Why I wrote the book that I wrote recently. I think if you take the three same domains, instead of being preoccupied whether or not we should have an energy transition, we're not going to have one. We should be more focused on what we can do to facilitate and accelerate. I think a structural revolution is comparable to what happened in the 1920s. In the material space, we have these classes of materials that exhibit properties that don't exist in nature, called metamaterials. We have smart materials, things that heal themselves, bioelectronic materials, biocompatible materials. Biocompatible materials means I can implant in you a sensor that will tell a physician and you if you're getting better or not getting better. But the sensors we implant now get rejected by your body because they're not biocompatible. And by being biocompatible, also self-destructing into its constituent components. In machines, we're of course on the cusp of the age of autonomy, 3D printing, and molecular aids manufacturing. And then of course the information domains themselves. There's been nothing like the cloud and the ubiquity of it and infusion into every part of society. I don't mean social media. I mean the operational, economic efficiencies that are being slowly brought into every business, amplified not solely by, but amplified by artificial intelligence. It's the same architectural convergence. It's incredible. It would make one incredibly optimistic about the next decade or 2 or half century. It makes me optimistic about the next century. This will mature, blossom, create opportunities. It will also, for those who are obsessed about energy, lead to astonishing increases in energy consumption, because all this stuff has to be built and operated. And we'll get far better photovoltaic cells and better electric cars. There'll be lots of them. If I had to pick a number for the year 2030, the world has 1.4 billion I'll end with this sort of a forecast, right? Because the avatar for the energy transition has become the electric vehicle. There's 1.4 billion vehicles in the world today, light-duty vehicles. By 2030, there'll probably be 2 or 3 billion. And a billion of them, maybe, half a billion could be electric cars. I don't think that's going to be a billion, but pick a billion. That's a lot of electric cars from 30 million. And they'll be better and more efficient. There's still a billion other cars using gasoline, which is as many as using today, basically. So it won't change the game because we'll need energy to make the billion electric cars. And we'll be using oil to make those billion electric cars because you can't build the big machines that dig up the big rocks with battery-powered vehicles. The energetics don't work. The physics doesn't work. So the transition to close is a made-up word when what's going on is in terms of energy terms, is an addition to the energy capacities of the world, all of which are needed. And the transition that's actually occurring is in the underlying capacities to make and manufacture and operate things that use energy. And to constrain the ability to do that by artificial increases in the cost of energy is really antithetical to progress. We won't get the progress if we make energy more expensive, which is essentially what governments are doing right now. And I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions.
What do you think the freshwater implications are of all this?
Well, so we have an infinite supply of water, as you know. So the only barrier between making the supply infinite is cheap energy or better knowledge about how to convince the hydrogen and oxygen atoms to separate. So I would say I'm more optimistic than I've ever been at a step function change in catalysis than any time in the past, because I'm sure you know, what's going on now in AI-driven supercomputers is that you can do in silico, chemistry experiments by the billions. So your physics model is simply telling you what water is like, and I want to convince the ocean to become fresh water. Well, that takes energy and ideas. I think we're likely to get that to happen. Some of the new filters, some of the new graphene class filters look incredibly promising. The challenge with them is they're too expensive, to manufacture at scale. You know what I'm talking about. The graphene filters will, at very low energy, allow you to let water molecules transit and nothing, no salt, no pollutants. You get pure water on the side. But they're really expensive to make at scale. Well, okay. The one thing engineers are really good at, sometimes it takes them longer than other times, but one thing they're always good at is once you tell them this material can do something, they generally get much better at figuring out how to make that material that has economic value. So I think the short-term water is a problem because we don't have fresh water. Has to be water that's rained on the earth, and we have rivers and lakes. If we want to transport fresh water, when I was younger, we worried about this in Canada. And when I first moved to the United States, people used to say seriously that we should do one of two things: build a pipeline from the Mackenzie River. The largest flow of water, fresh water in the world, is not the Nile or the Amazon; it's the Mackenzie. The Mackenzie flows north into the Arctic. It's an incredible river. Oh, there's nobody up there. I mean, there's a few people. You could build a pipe. We know how to build pipes. Just pipe it down. And the reason we're not doing it because it's expensive pipe, obviously. So I don't think it's a problem.
So one other kind of question on that is, the issue of this energy. I just came back from May to listen to talk. So and they were using the term energy expansion.
So you saw a great speech from Scott Tinker at lunch. I bet.
Yeah, energy expansion.
Yeah.
Rather than energy transition.
Exactly.
It was, but it's the countries that represent the poor 7 billion instead of the rich billion.
Yeah.
Rich billion is all about fear. It's about the climate.
Yeah.
And for the 7 billion, it's about bringing out the 7 billion to a level of wealth and betterment of their society, which is far more of a successful mindset for making these changes. And that slide you showed of the interesting technologies that were coming out were very indicative of a lot of that.
Yeah. So I don't have any. So the issue is always about timing. So that's why I had the bracketed these many slides with the two two information-centric ones. All of the epiphanies in understanding how to manipulate materials to create or use energy. The epiphany to a useful machine is measured in decades. And it's been true for 2 centuries. It's not accelerating. It's accelerating change trope. What's accelerating is, social media. The underlying things we built aren't accelerating. So all those things are on the same kind of timelines. And we'll find some utility function, but at the scales we're talking about, to change how we supply energy to the world. The low-hanging fruit or the highest value opportunities lie in profoundly more efficient ways to use hydrocarbons, not to replace them. So if our goal is to get more energy to the poorer part of the world, if you utilize it more efficiently, cost effectively, obviously it is the same as making it cheaper. Those are all the low-hanging fruit lies, even as very simple things which is not on anybody's roadmap. One could increase the operating temperature of all the world's boilers, every power plant, every machine that's using heat. The reason we don't do that is because the steels that to make that possible are expensive, but they exist. But it'd be a far cheaper way to cut fuel use and emissions than everything else we're doing. To subsidize that, it would be far faster because we know how to do it, and it's scalable because it's a steel. But it's not on anybody's radar because we have, to your point, a narrative, which is we have to transition. If there's a transition away, the expansion is the right word, or addition. The world has always expanded its energy supplies, absent wars or pandemics. And the world has always added into that expansion. So it's actually both. It's an addition and expansion. And that's why I put the wood stuff up. I mean, even something we're talking millennia of using wood in the world is not using less wood. It's using roughly the same amount. So per capita, trivial, right? But I think but we're fighting. We're fighting is the belief in a narrative that says we have to do this. And my view on this is it doesn't matter whether you think you have to do it or not. The reason I focused mostly on what I focused on is you can't do it. To think you can do it without destroying economies is really profoundly naive and dangerous. That's the problem.
You might want to walk back your statement and say if you get boilers more efficient, you'll reduce emissions.
What's that?
You said if you make boilers more efficient, you'll probably reduce emissions.
You reduce emissions from that boiler, and then you make
I'm just giving a Jevons paradox.
The Jevons paradox, as you know, as he wrote himself, is not a paradox.
Yeah.
He in fact clearly wrote that he knew people would read the paper and think it was paradoxical, and then, of course they could call that ever since.
Yeah,
I know.
I agree with you on that. So let me say that perhaps you're not steel manning the case for, let's just say, what's called the degrowth movement. Not that I like the word.
The degrowth movement.
Yeah. Which I would say if you steel man it, someone would give the exact same presentation you gave and say they're a part of the degrowth movement.
Well, yeah, sure.
And they agree with the constraints of climate. They're saying, well, given these limits, and given these things, we can't actually operate the way we currently operate.
Sure.
What you call the word progress, they can call it's a path to a ruin, and we'll have to figure out another way to be, live and define progress, perhaps. So how would you? So
steel
man that case. Do you agree with that, or do you?
I think the scholars that are doing are saying I hope I'll accurately rephrase what you're saying, because I don't think you could be heard necessarily. So there is a school of thought, serious people who are smart, who agree with me on the underlying physics and engineering and timelines of energy systems. And because that's true, I could have shown not just the decline in use of airplanes, decline in use of heated homes and clothes washing, but also the decline in population and decline in absolute GDP needed, and by defining a degrowth movement to redefine what we mean by wealth and redefine what we mean by progress. So there's a very large body of scholarship on this now, as you know, about trying to convince people and governments to redefine growth, progress, what we mean by wealth. First, I think that's the right debate to have, because that's the choice. So the choice is not going to be, do we find a better perfect path to use far less energy but still have the growth that most of the world thinks they want. to get the path to far less energy, far fewer emissions of carbon dioxide and hydrocarbons, will require profound lifestyle changes and fewer people and a smaller economy. And okay, if that's a good debate, that's a public policy, social debate. That's not a physics debate. That's actually an admission of a physics or economic fact. To get to that goal requires not new technologies per se, but a radical redefinition of what we consider progress. So let me tell you what I think about that. I think it's immoral, and I profoundly disagree with it. So that's just without being subtle. I think it's also silly. And I'll tell you why I think it's silly. I think it's immoral because it condemns a lot of people to poverty. There are billions of people who live at what we would consider subsistence, and they can't elevate themselves without a lot more energy. And there's a lot of them. They're not going to die. Yeah.
So I think the DECO scholar would say, yeah, they're talking about essentially OECD countries, but not.
Yeah, he wants everybody in OECD to be unkind, to kill themselves and stop using stuff or just live in a hovel. So the billion in the OECD go away, and the 6 billion you can have our energy. So you can do the math on that. That they're not going to. We give them all our energy. They still are. They're at 1/6 of our energy, right? So, or 1/10. So, but the problem is, and this is sort of a truism I learned in doing engineering physics, doing some investing, working in policy. In the end, there aren't really good metrics for measuring things we call progress. I mean, it's a really interesting intellectual problem. We live longer than most times in history, but there are other things wrong with our life, right? And social media would be a good example, a poster child example. People don't read as much as they should. There's a whole set of things that we can agree to argue about that we think are probably bad. And there's dozens of things like that. So when you sort of wrestle with comparing our time to another time, our culture to another culture, and you look for metrics that would tell you whether we're better off. We've made progress to having, say, plumbing and not being killed by sewage, and having it not die from freezing, or having buildings that can withstand hurricanes and drought-resistant crops. All those things that bring survivability up and comfort and conveniences. All those things are absent for most people. The OECD has a thing that they call the deprivation index, which I think is a really nice index. It's a measure of the number of people in the country that have 10 basic things. A roof over their house, a toilet, telephone, lights, really basic stuff. And the deprivation index doesn't measure how many dollars they have. It just measures those things. So it's a different way. And of course, it's a useful measure, but it doesn't answer the question, how do I get that stuff? So whether you're trying to figure out whether a machine will work or not, whether a government policy would work or not, it always redounds to follow the money. Who's getting the money? How much money am I spending? How much am I really spending? And who's giving them? Where does it come from? Who gets it? Because in fact, that first graph I showed you where I'm beating up on my physics friends for worthless terms. We know for a fact that all the energy terms are worthless. They're just garbage in a sense, because a BTU of kinetic energy is not equal to BTU of heat. I can convert kinetic energy to heat with friction, but it doesn't convert efficiently, and it's the exact same thing in the physics. There's no loss of energy. The system's closed, right? So how do I measure it? Well, money. So the argument I have with the degrowthers is I don't want to measure progress with money. There really isn't any other metric. The problem is it's not a perfect metric of prosperity. A lot of people get wealthier and they're worse off, but broadly speaking, I don't think we have a metric. And it's the only metric you can tell the real difference between photons of a fireplace and photons from a laser. The laser photons cost a lot more, about 1 million times more. But you can heal eyes with a laser photon. You can only burn eyeballs with a fireplace. So the entropic phenomenon that goes on when you add technology to energetics is measured by the machines you use. But the only way I can measure the machine, for people who don't know anything about machines, and most people don't, is the money. This machine costs this much, and this machine costs that much, and it produced the same unit of energy. So this is the problem with the solar wind stuff, because episodic power doesn't have the same utility function, obviously, is continual power. It's, time value of energy matters, but the only way you can really measure ultimately is dollars. So that's a long answer to, I think the problem with dollars is serious, especially because of inflation and all the other things. I love this area of literature. I've been reading about it for decades. It's fascinating. Finding a better metric for progress. I think it has to be money. Sadly, maybe for the people who don't like it to be money. It's been money since Croesus, and it's been and it's the easiest way to compare things across time and space. There's a really great economic historian. That's one of my favorite books called The Great Wave. Yale. He's retired, emeritus now. He says the single most abundant source of information about history is the price of what things cost over history. You know, it's very hard to tease out what people thought, what they did, what they said, you know, but what they paid for things, we have incredibly robust data because everybody recorded it. There's lots of stuff recorded. We know what Egyptians paid for food and water and slavery, and they paid for labor, and they paid for materials. We got data of all the stuff over all of history. So it allows you to look at things across time and history and cultures that would be impossible if my metric was BTUs, well, that's interesting, or tons, and his book, by the way, is really about inflation, and that's a whole separate subject. So it's money, and for me, it was the single most useful academic book I read in 30 years to think about energetics of systems, because then you could look back over transitions in time and how we changed manufacturing, you know, from wool to cotton, and then how do you measure that? What do garments cost? We know exactly what garments cost. We know what they cost throughout all of history. And there was a collapse in garment costs, and people dressed better, stayed warmer. It was the biggest industrial revolution of that era was the garments industry. Trade in garments went from being specialty to, it was the oil of the era, cotton. There's a great book on that if you haven't seen it. It's called Cotton.
Who was the author for The Great Wave?
The Great Wave. This is really terrible. I forgot his name. He's still with us. If you go to the magic Amazon machine and books, you find it.
Well, there's a lot of them.
So try to go to Dr. Google, The Great Wave, economist, Yale. Yeah, it's kind of like how you have to do ChatGPT prompts. You have to get prompts right. It's a really terrific book. It's about 15 years old now. The history has not changed.
You mentioned that there's this physical constraint that governments have tried to close with subsidies, which is not going to happen. Right? And economists will go around and say, yeah, well, we have the magic bullet, which is carbon tax. So we can do it. You know. So what's your thoughts on that?
Son, I only play economist on TV, so I don't have an economics degree. So, and I've been arguing publicly, indirectly with Holden Jenkins on this. I don't know if you saw my letter to the Wall Street Journal last week. And I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal 3 years ago on this. So the problem with the carbon tax is it has three core elements that are a problem, and they're not. It is true if you tax something, you get less of it. So what they're saying to argue their case is it's a very simple tax. You just tax it. So you're taxing all hydrocarbons equally, more or less, and that'll make them all more expensive, and that will mean you'll get less of those used because markets will do something. It's true. So what you want to do when you're taxing everything, remember my Department of Everything. So hydrocarbons are used not for some things; they're used to manufacture everything. The fact that they're 82% of the world's energy is misleading. They're used in 100% all human activities. Period. You cannot give me an exception. They're always used. So the cost of hydrocarbons and its availability is central. So if you tax hydrocarbons artificially, you're taxing everything. So my first objection is that's progressive. Then the economists then become politicians who say, well, we'll give the money back to the poor people. Okay, I mean, government vague on this stuff is really, really dangerous. First, I don't trust the government to give it to the people that they say they're going to give it to, because that becomes political. And the government overhead on this is not going to be a round trip. And if it's a round trip, you just made the energy cheaper for them, they're going to do it anyway. So if you have a carbon tax for the guy who has to drive 80 miles to mow your lawn, and he can only afford a 10-year-old pickup truck, and he gets a check back, he's going to keep driving the damn pickup truck because it's cheap, it's capital is cheap. So it's fallacious that it will change behavior because they're going to round trip it. If they don't round trip it, yes, it will change behavior. Raise the price enough, you will change behaviors. It was called deprivation, it's called recessions, because it's a tax on everything. Since we have robust historic data on the market's response to high hydrocarbon prices. We know this because we've had hydrocarbons in common circulation for 200 years. So we know how markets respond to higher prices. So we can answer the question, what would a tax have to be to make the competition, to make demand go down, to make the competition affordable? So first demand, we know what the answer is. For oil, it's about $200 a barrel. You have a meaningful impact on oil consumption at $200 a barrel. You don't at 120, because we've done it over and over again. But you have meaningful impact at 200. Okay, let's see how that goes politically. $200 a barrel. So triple the price of gasoline. I'll take the bet on how that goes politically. So that's the tax you have to have. And the most serious problem with the carbon tax trope is the implicit, if not explicit, assertion that the way you get innovation is through taxation. Because we're now waving the hand of markets will respond and innovate alternatives. They'll make batteries cheaper because they make gasoline more expensive. The reason I showed the physics graph is that you can make batteries cheaper. They're going to get cheaper on Wright's law curve. But if I double the cost of gasoline, it doesn't make batteries cheaper. That makes gasoline more expensive, and the batteries are the same price. So, well, no, they'll invent one because people are now willing to pay more. No, they're not. They're unhappy that they're paying more, and so the idea that, I'll do more simplistic, the idea that uranium fission happened because we taxed coal is prima facie silly. The idea that airplanes were invented because we taxed ships, silly. The idea that we got the LED because we taxed light bulbs, silly. So this whole carbon tax thing is based on those kinds of pivots, epiphanies in technology are going to happen. What will happen is if you make everything more expensive, it's easier to compete on the margin, but you've made the economy poorer, so everything just gets pushed down. So it's a dynamic model, but it doesn't get you what they're claiming. The essence of the claim is it'll stimulate innovation, and over time, all that money will end up, because it's all that money. I mean, if people want to pay that much, surely you could invent a better airplane. People already all want to fly. The reason that we only have a tiny percentage of the world's people flying regularly is because it's too expensive. If we cut the cost of flying by tenfold, we'll have 100 times more air miles. That's what will happen. But if we make airplane more expensive, people will fly less. That's right, with fewer vacations. And so they'll get their degrowth wish. So the carbon tax is degrowth, period. And the market economists are claiming it'll stimulate innovation, apparently have never studied history, because there's no evidence in history where the taxation creates foundational innovation. It does create workarounds and nuances, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about replacing the foundational energetics of the entire world's economy, from steel making to flying to pharmaceutical production, all of it. We're going to replace all that with unobtainium. I don't understand how they can think that. It really puzzles me. But I do agree, high enough. The problem with the carbon tax proposal is the way it's being proposed, other than the round trip nonsense, which means it defeats its purpose, and the money is just bled off with the government. They'll use it for other purposes, pay on a deficit, do war fighting, whatever. They'll steer it to their friends, but they're not going to do what they said. The real fundamental problem with it is that it's not something that creates any value. So the microeconomics tax this, and I'll get less beer consumed because I tax beer. Sure, people will drink wine instead, but there's no alternative. That's the point. The trope has it at its root. There's a physics alternative. There's an engineering alternative in timeframes that are meaningful. And the reason I ended with that last slide with these other incredible things. I mean, graphene. The guy who figured out the magic angle at MIT. This is really cool stuff. So graphene, if you don't know what graphene, everybody knows what graphene is, right? Single carbon layer. It's one atom thick layer of carbon atoms. It's called graphene. Magical properties. There's all kinds of stuff that's crazy science fiction stuff. But if you have two layers of graphene at what's called the magic angle, 22.5 degrees, they become superconductors. Who knew? I mean, no one had any idea of that. First of all, nobody knew graphene existed until the people who got the Nobel Prize for it found it by accident. So serendipity is a bitch because you can't predict it. And how did they get it by accident? A piece of Scotch tape tore some carbon off a pencil, and just for a chuckle, they looked at it under a scanning electron microscope, and it was a perfect monatomic layer of carbon. And for years, it's how they made graphene. It's literally tape ripping it off like a carbon block. So manufacturing graphene is real hard. Magic angle, the physics of that is consequential, because if you could imagine making it a room temperature, low-cost superconductor, then you could imagine storing electricity like we store oil. So the difference between storing energy in a battery and energy in a barrel of oil in economic terms is 300-fold. So I spent 300 times more unit energy to store it in the battery versus oil. Now, why don't I store oil in my phone? Well, because to make the oil useful as an electric generator, I don't have an engine that scales down to do that. So if you can make an engine scale down, I wouldn't use a lithium battery. I would put oil in this phone, or it would be butane, like a lighter. But the physics of engines don't scale. They scale inversely when you make them small, whereas they become less efficient. They don't work well. They would make engines like that. The same MIT guys have built chip scale engines, reciprocating engines that burn fuel, but they really suck. They're terrible. Whereas the energetics are 100 times poorer than an ant, and ants are magic. So what you want to do is invent an actuator like the ant's muscle, and then you could make all kinds of cool stuff. But all those things, I think that those kinds of phenomenologies are essentially inevitable, and a lot of economic historians who I've argued with say, well, you can't just wave your hands and say there's more innovation coming. Just wait. Yes, you can, because all of history has shown that. But what's unfortunate about it in energy fields is that all the stuff that's new takes time, and nobody likes the time. So they think they can accelerate with taxes and subsidies. So that's why I showed the efficiency limits of wind turbines. You can subsidize the hell out of wind turbines. The physics limits of how much kinetic energy converts to air is dictated by Bett's law, and you can't change that. If you take all the kinetic energy out of air, there's no air moving. It stops moving, so the blade doesn't rotate. So you can think it in simplistic terms. There's sort of Goldilocks where the blade's spinning and getting an optimal amount of energy out of it. You can make the turbine bigger, so it's got a bigger swept area. These are all economies of scale that engineers have done for a long time. But it's not 10 times better, right? It's incrementally better. And for wind to compete with burning gas in a gas turbine to supply energy 24/7, it needs to be roughly 3 to 10 times better. To supply energy episodically, they're just fine. Because it's like anything else. It's like food. Episodic supply of certain passes of food are fine, but if you wanted to make everybody only eat Chateaubriand, to be simplistic, it'd be kind of hard. And it's kind of hard for the same kind of physics economics reasons. So I've ranted about the carbon tax because it's so crazy to have market economists invoke the market when they should know better. It's one thing if you're a market statist and you think that that's a good thing. Back to degrowth, the easiest way to get less consumption is to tax the hell out of all energy, and your consumption will go down. It's called a recession, and if you push it hard enough, you get a depression, and people will do less stuff and they'll consume less energy, and emissions will go down. We measure that during the COVID lockdowns. We have global measurements of the reduction in total energy use. You can see it, and
some people really liked it.
And some people thought that was good. They want to do that on steroids. But I would say if you look at the graph in terms of the absolute reduction in global energy use, it's surprisingly small. I mean, it's shockingly small. So you shut the entire free world down. And if you look at the graph, I didn't put in this massive set, a little blip, hiccup, and had no effect on CO2 emissions. Because, yeah, it did, in a sense. You weren't driving your car, you were burning something. But in terms of the absolute loading to the atmosphere, it made no difference. Any other objections? That if you can have an objection, I mean, but you'll be wrong. No, I'm kidding.
I don't necessarily have an objection. I have two objections.
I'm gonna read your book.
We'll reference useful work or work output, not as a one-to-one substitute for looking at money, but as a extremely interesting comparison.
Yeah, you make a really good point.
So it's harder to measure, but that's what.
Well, you make a really good point. If you could hear what he said. How do you measure what you do with energy systems? You want to measure useful work. So that's what physicists do. So useful power is different than absolute power. Not in politics. I mean, in politics, absolute power is all that matters. Because you're trying to accomplish something. So you're not looking for the measure of how you deliver useful work to a point of action, whether it's to melt something or move something. And yeah, sure. But that's why I say, but I can increase the amount, the decreased amount of energy used to create the same unit of useful work. There's lots of ways to do that. The problem is they all cost money, which is why I come back to the money. Or they create inconveniences that have social costs that are being imposed on people. If they volunteer for it, again, simplistically, running your dishwasher at night to the daytime at peak. It's the same useful work, but the total energy cost of delivery goes down because I'm using the system at an optimal point. It's not trying to meet a peak demand, and meeting peak demands requires more capital construction that's used episodically. So the total cost of the system is higher. The useful work is the same, but the cost of the, okay. But I've told people like, you can't run a dishwasher now, or you can't charge your car now, or you can't manufacture your product here. So you get into engaging in both economic and social decisions. So, which is why most of the work I do, I have an opinion on what those social decisions should be. They're both my opinions. But what I really want to have happen is I want people to be aware that the proposals invoke an economic or social decision. And if they want to make it, because they think it's where you go, but then you get into the different problems. You're going to impose it on me, because now you're imposing a social behavioral decision on me. That's essentially the fight we're having, I think, politically right now, is the magnitude of that. We always do that in governance, but it's the question of magnitudes. And again, I reveal my bias. I'm on the more market-oriented side of letting people decide with information than I am on the state and the technocrats telling me this is what needs to be done because we can predict the future. I mean, maybe a bottom line truism of energy is true of technology, is true about everything in life. Whether it's food or fuel, transport, we're really lousy at predicting future demands. We're really lousy at that. That's all economists and markets. But we're really good at building things that can meet demands. So the disconnect happens. That's how commodity prices get involved. Is that we know how to build mines and airplanes. We know how to build solar turbines. We know how to build them. It's not complicated. But guessing how many of them we'll need is the real difficult part. And that's where social, economic factors, technology change comes in. But to be safe for the next decade, let's say, since we don't know what demands will be, whether it's electricity, a grid, or food, what societies have done over most time is overbuild capacity to meet uncertainty. And we're now doing the opposite of that. We're underbuilding capacity to meet uncertainty, including, incidentally, in my old profession, warfighting. I was a Cold Warrior to design anti-missile systems, and we're underbuilding that too right now. It's evidenced by the Russian conflict.
One last question. There's a lot of pressure right now on oil companies to not be oil companies. Mm-hmm. And so what are the examples in industrial history where companies that were really excellent at one thing were able, when they got to a scale, were able to successfully transition into something different?
It's pretty rare. Fisher Coach made stagecoach bodies, and they became if you look on a General Motors product, the Fisher body, the label, sometimes they made car bodies, but they're kind of similar. So it's not, that's the buggy whip transition.
They moved to adjacent.
It was an adjacent move, but to do the equivalent of go from oil to wind or selling gasoline to selling electricity, I've thought a lot about examples over history, but by and large, there might be a few exceptions. It doesn't happen. So the oil company's posture should be very simple, and I think some of them are drawing that. We know how to drill for oil. If you want to make it illegal to buy oil, you go. You want to tax oil, you can tax oil. But we know how to do oil. We'll produce oil for the world if it wants it at a price that we can manage. If you want to build biofuels plants, compete with us, go ahead. The principal objections go into back the other complicated issue of subsidizing the other guy and creating an economic disadvantage. Tax the carbon for the oil guys, but give a subsidy to the ethanol guys. At a trivial scale, it's irrelevant, but to do it, again, at a societal scale, it's destructive. So I think politically, the oil companies should simply stay in their lane. Similar to General Motors should make internal combustion engines. They are really lousy at making EVs compared to Elon Musk and BYD. They'll eventually figure it out, but why bother? Just buy a company, get their market value back up and buy something, or buy themselves private. If I were General Motors with their keep getting whacked, I'd take the company private and make cars that people want to buy. But if the government bans internal combustion engines, which 12 states have in the District of Columbia, and that ban stays in place, then they're gambling that they're going to go out of business. If I was on that board, I'd say take the gamble, own the market, because those laws will be novated because they can't be met. The world can't build that many EVs. If they try, the price of used cars will inflate, and you'll have a political revolt over the cost of transportation. Because the cost of EVs are not going to go down significantly, but the cost of internal combustion engines that are available will go up. So I just think that form of market manipulation It's very different than if we decide that we should charge you money as a consumer of carbon fuel for the carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, it's a political decision. Charge the money. Go ahead. It won't change that unless you charge enough in the tax. It won't change the behavior. It'll just make society slightly poorer until tax is high enough, and then oil company will have less product. If I were being cynical, I would say Exxon could care less whether we tax carbon, whether they ban internal combustion engine, whatever. You go. I think they're probably a little more optimistic than. I think they're optimistic that won't happen only because of how they've reoriented their global business. I've noticed over the last 2 years that you've dealt with they've done a lot more focus on the U.S. U.S. offshore, our hemisphere, and U.S. shale, and as is Chevron, divesting from higher political risk domains globally. So that's a bet that the world needs oil, and it's a bet that it'll be easier to produce it ultimately over the decades here than offshore Nigeria. So I think there's evidence of doing that. I mean, just behavioral, they're going back. BP, not so much, but it's BP.
Shell's doing that.
Show that?
Shell.
Yeah, Shell did the same thing. Absolutely. And that's, but again, if setting aside sensible behaviors on taxing pollutants and constraining safety behaviors for building stuff, those are all normal functions of governments, why we built governments to do those things. The debates get in the gray zone of, well, we're adding carbon dioxide as the pollutant, and we're going to charge you and tell you not to emit it. Okay, we've been doing that, and we're going to keep doing it. I don't have any illusions that that's going to end. I'm just saying that it's not going to cause an energy transition. It's not. What it's going to do is raise the cost of energy, and at some point, if you raise it enough, people will object. And if you don't raise it too much, it'll just be a permanently slightly higher cost for hydrocarbons. And we can afford it. Or, it's a $25 trillion economy in the United States. If you make energy $500 billion more expensive per year than it should be, I think it's probably a bad idea, but we're not going to go bankrupt. So that's sort of the experiment I think that we're in. If we make it 1 or 2 trillion a year, which is the path it's on, given the fundamentals of engineering, then I think there become problems because it becomes inflationary. And then when you start looking for how do you stop inflation, the easy target is cut energy costs. I thank you for this was far longer than you probably imagined.
You can ask a question. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.